November 20th, 1941. 350 horse-drawn carts stand at the western shore of Lake Ladoga, waiting for ice that might not hold. Behind them, 2.9 million people are dying. The city of Leningrad has been cut off from the world for 73 days. German artillery surrounds it on 3 sides. The Baltic Sea blocks the 4th. Inside the encirclement, bread rations have just been slashed to 125 grams per day for civilians, for children, for the elderly. 125 grams. 4 slices, that's everything. Not 4 slices for breakfast. 4 slices for an entire day of human existence. The temperature is dropping. Winter is coming. And the only thing standing between this city and total annihilation is a frozen lake that doesn't freeze the same way twice. The siege of Leningrad would become the deadliest blockade in human history. Over 1 million people would die. Most from starvation. Most in the winter that was about to begin, but on this November day, 350 carts prepared to cross the ice anyway, because someone had made a decision. Not to surrender, not to abandon the city, but to build a road where no road should exist. A road made of ice. A road that would crack and shift and swallow trucks whole. A road that would save just enough people to keep the city alive while letting hundreds of thousands die anyway. They called it the Road of Life. The decision to use it, to send convoys across ice that might break at any moment, to gamble lives on centimeters of frozen water, would determine whether Leningrad survived or became the largest mass grave in modern warfare. This is the story of how one impossible convoy route kept a city breathing when every logical calculation said it should have suffocated. The German Ring closed on September 8, 1941. Wehrmacht and Finnish forces had advanced to within artillery range of Leningrad's center. They did not need to assault the city. They simply needed to wait. Adolf Hitler had given explicit orders no surrender would be accepted. The city would be starved into non-existence. Its population would die where it stood. The mathematics were simple and horrifying. Leningrad needed 1,500 tons of food per day to feed its population at subsistence levels. Every day, without exception. The city had almost no strategic reserves when the blockade began. Within weeks, warehouses were empty. Factories stopped because workers collapsed at their stations. Orphanages ran out of food for children. By November, people were eating leather belts, boiling wallpaper paste for the starch, mixing sawdust into bread dough. Deaths quadrupled in December, then quadrupled again. By January and February of 1942, 100,000 people were dying every month. Bodies lay in the streets because no one had the strength to bury them. Families kept corpses in their apartments because the deceased person's ration card was the only thing keeping the living fed for a few more days. If you're finding this history as compelling as we are, consider hitting the like button for the Orders of History channel. These forgotten stories of impossible decisions deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us keep digging into the archives. The only geographic feature that offered any hope was Lake Ladoga. The massive freshwater lake stretched northeast from Leningrad's outskirts. Its eastern shore remained in Soviet hands. If supplies could somehow be moved across that lake, across 60 kilometers of open water or ice, they could reach the city. In autumn, before the freeze, Soviet boats had attempted to ferry supplies across. The Ladoga flotilla controlled the water, but German aircraft hunted every vessel. Boats were slow. Boats were vulnerable. Boats could carry only limited cargo before winter made navigation impossible. When the lake froze, boats became useless. But ice created a different kind of possibility. The idea seemed insane. Lake Ladoga is not a pond. It's an inland sea with waves, currents, and ice that forms unevenly depending on wind and temperature. The ice could be 30 centimeters thick in one spot and 5 centimeters thick 10 meters away. Pressure ridges could buckle the surface without warning. Underwater currents could thin the ice from below, creating invisible traps. Driving a truck across that ice wasn't transportation. It was Russian roulette with a full cylinder. But Soviet engineers began calculating anyway. They measured ice thickness. They calculated load-bearing capacity. They determined that ice needed to be at least 18 centimeters thick to support a horse-drawn cart. 20 centimeters for a light truck. Thicker still for heavier vehicles. The decision was made at the highest levels of Soviet command. The State Defense Committee issued Decree No. 604 on August 30th, authorizing the transportation of goods to Leningrad. By November, with the city starving in real time, there was no more time for caution. On November 19th, Order No. 00172 was issued to the Leningrad front. It authorized the creation of an automotive and tractor route across Lake Ladoga. It gave the route a bureaucratic designation, Military Automobile Road No. 101, and it committed the Soviet Union to a logistical gamble that would either save the city or drown its last hope in freezing water. November 20th, 1941. The first convoy left the western shore. 350 horse-drawn carts. Drivers wrapped in whatever clothing they could scavenge. Horses already weakened from lack of fodder. Each cart carried as much as the ice would theoretically bear. The ice held. Barely. Carts moved slowly, spacing themselves apart to distribute weight. Drivers listened for cracking sounds. They watched for water seeping up through fissures. If the ice groaned too loudly, you turned back. If you saw a dark patch ahead, you detoured. If a cart ahead of you broke through, you did not stop to help. You kept moving because the convoy behind you depended on the route staying open. The crossing took hours. On November 21st, 63 tons of flour reached the Osinovet station on Leningrad's side of the lake. 63 tons. For a city that needed 1,500 tons per day. It was nothing. It was a rounding error. It was barely enough to feed one neighborhood for 24 hours, but it proved the route could work. The next day, 60 Gaze AA trucks attempted the crossing. Light vehicles, Soviet-made, carrying more cargo than the carts. The trucks moved in single file, engines straining, drivers knowing that if the ice gave way there would be no rescue. The lake was too cold for survival. You went through the ice, you died. Simple as that. The trucks made it across. Military Automobile Road, No. 1. 01 was operational. Now came the impossible part. Turning a theoretical ice road into a functioning supply artery for a dying city. The road had to be rebuilt constantly. Ice doesn't stay the same thickness. It shifts. It melts in patches where underground springs flow. It thickens where cold air settles. Every day, teams of engineers walk the route with measuring tools, checking thickness, marking dangerous areas, rerouting traffic around weak spots. When trucks broke through, which they did regularly, crews had to work in sub-zero temperatures to retrieve wreckage and mark the hole. If a vehicle went down, it created a weak point. Ice doesn't heal. You had to route around it, and the detour created new pressure on ice that hadn't been tested yet. German forces knew exactly what the Soviets were doing. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights spotted the convoys immediately. German artillery on the southern shore began targeting the ice road. Shells would explode on the frozen surface, shattering ice and creating craters that convoys had to navigate around. Aircraft strafed trucks, killing drivers, igniting fuel, turning the route into a killing ground. The Soviets responded with 2 divisions of NKVD internal troops to guard the route. Fighter regiments flew air cover. Anti-aircraft guns were dragged onto the ice itself, positioned to defend the convoys. Ice boats with gunners patrolled for saboteurs. Police forces guarded the loading and unloading points against marauders desperate enough to steal food meant for the starving city. The road became a battlefield. But the convoys kept moving. December brought colder temperatures. Colder was better. Colder meant thicker ice. Colder meant heavier vehicles could cross. By late December, the Soviets were running larger trucks, carrying more cargo, increasing the flow. On December 23, 1941, the Road of Life delivered 786 tons of supplies to Leningrad in a single day. For the first time since the siege began, the amount delivered exceeded the city's minimum daily consumption. Not by much. Not enough to rebuild reserves, but enough to stop the freefall. Soviet leadership sent Alexei Kosygin, a senior state official, to Leningrad in January 1942 to improve operations. Kosygin saw the conditions firsthand. He saw the emaciated workers, the frozen bodies, the children with swollen bellies from starvation edema. He requested authorization to evacuate 500,000 civilians. The Road of Life would now serve two purposes. Inbound convoys brought food, ammunition, and fuel. Outbound convoys evacuated the dying. Families were loaded onto trucks for the return journey. Many died during the crossing. The cold, the stress, the fact that their bodies had been starving for months and couldn't survive the shock of movement. But those who made it across reached Soviet territory where food existed, where hospitals functioned, where survival was possible. By the time the ice began to melt in April 1942, the Road of Life had transported 361,000 tons of cargo into Leningrad. 262,000 tons of that was food. The rest was ammunition, fuel, and medicine. 550,000 people had been evacuated. The ice road had operated for 152 days, and then the ice became too thin to hold weight. The spring thaw turned Lake Ladoga back into open water. The Road of Life disappeared as if it had never existed, but the city was still besieged. The Germans still surrounded Leningrad on three sides. The dying continued, just slower now. Controlled starvation instead of catastrophic freefall. When winter returned in late 1942, the Soviets rebuilt the road. They did it again. Same lake, same ice, same calculations about thickness and load and risk. Engineers refined their techniques. Convoys moved faster. The Luftwaffe still attacked, but Soviet air defenses had improved. More cargo flowed. The second winter of the ice road, from late 1942 into early 1943, delivered 118,000 tons of food, 55,000 tons of ammunition, 33,000 tons of coal and fuel. Another 88,000 people were evacuated. The road operated until March 30th, 1943, when the ice again became too unstable. By then, Soviet forces were preparing to break the siege militarily. In January 1943, Red Army offensives had opened a narrow land corridor into Leningrad, allowing rail supplies to reach the city. The Road of Life was no longer the only lifeline. But for 2 winters, it had been the difference between survival and extinction. The final accounting is brutal. Over the entire period the Road of Life operated, more than 1,600,000 tons of supplies reached Leningrad. Over 1,300,000 people were evacuated, but over 1 million people still died. Most of them died in that first winter, the winter when the convoys were just starting, when the ice was untested, when the city's reserves were already gone and people were too weak to survive even if food arrived. The Road of Life did not save everyone. It saved enough to keep the city alive, to keep factories producing munitions, to keep soldiers fighting, to prevent the complete annihilation Hitler had ordered. It was never enough to prevent mass death. It was only ever enough to prevent total death. The decision to build and operate the road of life was not a humanitarian triumph. It was a calculated gamble by a government that had already written off hundreds of thousands of lives. The Soviet state prioritized the strategic value of holding Leningrad over the survival of its population. Food was rationed to favor workers over children, soldiers over elderly, the functionally useful over the expendable. But within that cold arithmetic, the convoys represented something else. Every driver who crossed that ice knew the odds, knew the ice could break, knew German shells could find them, knew they might not come back. They drove anyway, because on the other side, people were eating sawdust, because children were dying in unheated apartments, because a city of 3 million was being erased from existence, and the only thing stopping that erasure was the decision to keep driving. The road of life was not one convoy. It was thousands of convoys, tens of thousands of individual crossings, each one a separate roll of the dice, each one a small miracle that the ice held long enough for the wheels to reach the other side. The siege of Leningrad officially ended on January 27, 1944, 872 days after it began, the longest and deadliest siege in modern history. When Soviet forces finally pushed German armies back and reopened land access to the city, they found a population that had been fundamentally altered. Survivors of the siege suffered long-term health consequences: cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders, psychological trauma that would echo through generations. The Road of Life is commemorated today as part of a World Heritage Site. Monuments mark the route. Memorials honor the drivers who died when the ice gave way. Museums preserve photographs of the convoys, the emaciated children, the frozen trucks half submerged in Ladoga's water. But the core truth remains uncomfortable. The Road of Life did not save Leningrad. It kept Leningrad from becoming a cemetery. There's a difference. One implies rescue. The other implies that the dying was merely slowed to a survivable rate. The decision to build the road, to send convoys across ice that was never guaranteed to hold, was not a choice between salvation and doom. It was a choice between total catastrophe and manageable catastrophe, between losing everyone and losing most. That's the math of siege warfare. That's the arithmetic of starvation logistics. You don't save cities, you save enough of the city to call it a city when the war ends. And so the convoys rolled, day after day, week after week, winter after winter, across ice that cracked and groaned and sometimes swallowed the trucks whole. Because the alternative was standing still and watching 3 million people disappear. The Road of Life stands as a monument to human endurance, yes, but also to the brutal reality that survival in total war is not about moral victories. It's about cold equations, about how much you're willing to lose to keep something, anything, alive on the other side. If this story made you think differently about the siege of Leningrad or the impossible logistics of survival, consider subscribing to Orders of History and sharing this with someone who appreciates military history that doesn't shy away from complexity. Drop a comment and tell us, did you know that a frozen lake route saved over 1 million people while another 1 million died waiting for the convoys to arrive? These are the kinds of decisions that define wars, and we'll keep exploring them as long as you keep watching.